Good morning from Scotland, and good afternoon or good evening if you're in Hong Kong and mainland China. I think we have quite a few people from that part of the world today. Welcome to the Asia Scotland Institute. My name is Martin Perbrick. I'm the Institute Director. Our focus today is on heritage buildings in China. A lesser discussed subject, I think, in Scotland, but a fascinating one, especially for those of us who've come from China recently and worked there for a long time and seen some of the fascinating historical buildings that are the subject of restoration now. And I'm very pleased to introduce three terrific experts on this subject, if I can call them that. I'm sure they're too modest to call themselves out, but they are. Firstly, Dr. Qian Gao is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Stirling. And her research focuses on the interrelationships between the understanding, use, conservation, and management of heritage across Western and Eastern societies, as well as the integration between humanistic and scientific approaches in heritage studies. She's involved in the ongoing cooperation between the University of Stirling, so she's here with us in Scotland, very pleased to say, Historic Environment Scotland, and the Palace Museum on the conservation of the Ling Zhao Xuan, also known as the Crystal Palace of the Forbidden City in Beijing. And this is what she's going to talk to us about this morning, specifically this project, and then the wider issues of conservation and restoration of heritage buildings. Next, we'll have Mr. Liu Xingcheng, who is another old friend from Hong Kong, who's now based in Guangzhou. Mr. Liu is the non-executive chairman of Grosvenor Asia Pacific. He's operated his own business in the real estate industry in mainland China since the 1990s, a very dynamic period of opening up and a very busy period, I'm sure I see. He initiated an award-winning renovation project in Panyu in Guangzhou about 5 years ago. And it's a fascinating building that you'll see some pictures of shortly. The Borderless community of Zerni 12 Portals, and he'll correct my pronunciation if you don't mind shortly, a multi-purpose co-living community concept conference and exhibition center, which was a former factory and a large sugar refinery plant in the 1950s. So quite an interesting adaptive reuse of a building. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Mr. Mike Moyer. Mike was my colleague. We were colleagues together in the Hong Kong Jockey Club for around 10 years, both of us directors there. Mike is also a former director of Swire Properties, and until 2019, he was director of property at the Hong Kong Jockey Club before returning to his native Scotland. I think Mike's from Inverness, now based in Edinburgh. Mike will talk to us about the creation of Tai Kwun in Hong Kong, which I also saw working with him at the same time. It's a terrific project, an extraordinary achievement for the people in the Jockey Club to have worked through this. The conservation, revitalization of a compound of 19th century colonial Hong Kong buildings, which comprise the Central Police Station, Central Magistracy, and Victoria Prison. And when I was a police officer in Hong Kong many years ago and used to visit Central Police Station, it was absolutely dilapidated. It was an awful place to work. So what Mike and his colleagues did was extraordinary to make it what it is now. And I think what they'll all talk to you about is that the restoration of historical buildings is more complex than most of us realize. Certainly me as a layman in this area as well. I think historical buildings often form part of a collective memory, especially in quite fast-growing cities where modern buildings dominate the environment. And I think consequently, there's great sensitivity about the use of historical buildings, and we found that in Hong Kong very much. So there are clearly challenges. It's not just a property project to restore a historical building. And our three panelists today will talk about those challenges as well as the projects themselves. So if I could just remind you all in the audience, we have a very big audience today. So to help us get through this 1 hour, which will go very quickly, I think, if you could mute your microphones, disable your camera, we can do it for you if someone has inadvertently left their mic open. If you have any questions, because we do want to get to a good question discussion section after the very brief presentations, then if you could send them to me through the Zoom chat function, either privately or to the whole group if you wish, and then we'll try to get through your questions at the end. I'm sorry to say, Roddy Gao, our chairman and founder of the Asia Scotland Institute, as he's at his second home on the east coast of the USA. It's 5 a.m. there, and I don't think Roddy will be dialing into this one. So we might see him at the end, let's see. So if I may, could I introduce Dr. Qian Gao, who's going to show us some slides of her project and talk through what she did with this aspect of the Forbidden City. Dr. Gao.
Hello, everyone. My name is Qian Gao. I'm from China, but currently I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Stirling in Scotland. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the ongoing collaboration, the Chinese-Scottish collaboration on the conservation of the Ling Zhao Xuan, also known as the Crystal Palace of the Forbidden City in Beijing. Well, it's an ongoing project and actually just sort of started in 2019, so 2019, 2 years ago, and because of COVID, it's sort of get delayed a little bit. But by itself, it's a fascinating historic building that we are doing the conservation works around. And and I hope I can bring you some interesting information. So it is a collaboration between the University of Stirling Historic Environment Scotland and the Palace Museum, the three-part collaboration on this very building. It's if you can see here that this is a map of the Palace Museum. As you know, the Palace Museum was the imperial residential place to dynasty of China, the Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty. And the very building we're talking about, the Ling Zhao Xuan, which is also called the Crystal Palace, is located in the Yanxi Gong, which is the Palace of Prolonged Happiness, which is in the one of the 6 east palaces in the inner courtyard of the Forbidden City, as you can see in this circle. So I'm going to talk about the collaboration. So the collaboration started, like I said before, around, well, actually signed the Memorandum of Understanding in 2017, but there are several components of that collaboration, and the conservation of this building is one part of this whole collaboration. And we have sort of conducted a few visits to the Forbidden City to check the current status of this very building, and there's some preliminary work has been done, but because of COVID, so now we are in a sort of a delayed phase of this whole project. I'm going to talk a little bit about this whole building itself. It's a very interesting building by itself. We all know that the Palace Museum is one of the largest collection of the wooden structure of the world. And this very building stands out as the only existing Western style building of the Palace Museum of the Forbidden City. So it was initially constructed in 1909 by the order of the royal family at the time, and it was never finished. But at the time, so this palace itself suffered, this small palace, the Palace of Prolonged Happiness itself suffered several fire accidents in the past, and it was decided based on feng shui, this area has too much the element of fire, so they need the element of water to counterbalance the energy there. So then the royal family at the time had this idea to build this 3-decker hall of water, following this Western, very popular at the time, the state-of-art sort of a cast iron structure building. That's why it gets the name Crystal Palace. So this type of building was popular after they had the Bastion. They had the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park in London. So, and also in Madrid. So that kind of building was very in fashion at the time. So it is built sort of on an artificial pond, as you can see, and it's a stripper hall of water, and the base of the building is the cast iron, and the wall is supposed to be tiled wall with ceramics. And the window is supposed to be like a glass window. So when this building, well, when it's supposed to be finished, water was supposed to be into the the pond, so to surrounding this building, so people in the basement could actually see the swimming the swimming fish through the glass window. That's why it's called the Crystal Palace. However, it was never finished because of the short budget. At the time, the Qin dynasty was facing the collapse. So, and also the chaotic was in both internal and external force this building to stop soon after it started. It was like let's say 90% finished, but after it was sort of a half finished, abandoned there for around 100 years, for a century, this building was sort of left there to be left it by itself, and nothing much has been done. And in general, it has been in a sort of a poorly preserved status for most of the year of the last century. And up until the 1970s, the basement of this building was filled with earth that was removed to make the air raid shelter. And at some point, sort of a bit of a sort of a rusting prevention method was conducted to prevent the cast iron pillar from collapse or from expansion. So a mortar was infilled into the hollow part of those cast iron pillars. All those kind of conservation activity was never recorded properly. So the current Palace Museum colleagues, they barely have any record regarding what kind of conservation work has been done to this very structure in the past few decades. They barely have any record. They only have the results of it. And so on the contrary, this very popular TV series released in like 3 years ago, 2018, which is named The Story of the Prolonged Happiness Palace. And the very popularity of that TV series has sort of made this building an instant celebrity. And suddenly, tourists came to the Palace Museum or flocked to this very site to want to have a look of this building that bears the same name of that TV show. And then people see this strangely looking sort of a hybrid Chinese Western style architecture standing there. And they start to ask questions like, what is it? What happened to it? Why among all those nicely constructed, preserved wooden complex of the Forbidden City, you have this odd looking Western style building standing here? And that's why at the moment, the Palace Museum colleagues are trying to find a proper way to preserve this building. Preliminary research on this building, the teams are sort of facing a range of very complex conservation issues, which include like structural integrity and the material authenticity. So all those material, because they were not preserved properly for the last century. So now, for example, the cast iron pillars, they're not very stable, and somehow its bearing capacity was also compromised. And also the mortar that has been used in several parts of this building also need to be analyzed and looked into. Also and another issue is the consideration of values and cultural significance. So what type of values are we going to preserve when we do this whole conservation, and what kind of preference, what kind of sort of priority should we place on when we consider the comprehensive plan to preserve this very building? And also various expectation and tourist demand, that's another issue, and the lack of skilled and specialized workers, because it's a cast iron structured building, and our Chinese colleague, most of them, they are not very familiar with this type of material. And also the condition of training and capacity building, also the institutional frameworks and restrictions in the case of international cooperation between two countries, and also different working modes between the two countries. However, there are some sort of let's say when we thought there are sort of a different understandings of the conservation philosophies or principles between the Eastern and Western expertise, but in fact, they are very converging understandings surrounding some issues in heritage. For example, the consideration of authenticity. This is a one quote from one of the colleagues there. It's like the key factors for the consideration of authenticity is about inheritance and passing on, and whether what we do for conservation purposes can ensure the process and passing on for not just the material fabrics of the building, but also the meanings and the stories associated with it. So even though based on the different education system, training system of the Western and Eastern expertise, for some very core issue in the whole idea of conservation, building conservation, example, the consideration of authenticity, the understanding is very convergent, even though sometimes we use different criteria, we use different phrasing when we do this kind of assessment. But anyway, the story is still going on, and there are a lot of work to be done regarding this very interesting hybrid building, and it's between a sort of a hybrid team, Scottish and Chinese. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to sharing more of the information when the story have more progress. Thank you.
Dr. Gao, thank you very much. It's fascinating to start with you and see this project involving Scotland and China, which is obviously exactly what we want to talk about from the Asia Scotland Institute. So going back to China, SC, over to you in Guangzhou.
Thank you, Martin.
We don't switch between languages today, but I think we could. We could have Putonghua, Guangdonghua, English and Scottish. But you know, if you could stick to English, then tell us about what you do. Yeah.
Good advice. I will try my best to stick to English. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depends on where you are. I'm going to talk a bit about a very small project which we involved in within the last 4 or 5 years. Originally, it was actually a part of a state-owned sugar refinery estate, and the estate was built in early 1950s, and I'm told the latest batch of sugar was sent out of the premises in late 1990. You can see this yellow building was the part of the oldest part of the estate, which you can see at the Russian style offices. And then there were, when I first came to the estate, there were various kind of industrial building. All of them were abandoned. We had cement plants, we had factory premises, you name it. When I first set my foot in the place, the whole thing looked like a war zone. I think I'm not exaggerating the situation. But anyway, I saw the potential of it. It was quite, when I first saw it, I thought it was quite special in the sense that it has a certain element of romance. But at the same time, it also made me remember of the old time in Hong Kong when I was very young. I mean, everything was developing, and of course, it passed its developing stage at that moment. But somehow I thought perhaps something could be done to revitalize it, and that's what we are doing. And actually, the small project we involved in is just a very small part of a very big estate, which is a renovation project. And previously, it was a fiberboard plant, and you can see we have a very small GFA, about marginally more than 5,000 meters square. And the original concept of the whole project was to build a multi-purpose co-living community. Now people talk about co-owning or co-sharing communities, ranging from co-working space to co-living space or sharing facilities, services, and stuff like that. And the co-living community concept was the original concept we started with. And now, because of reasons that I'm going to say a little bit more about, we are using it. We are using it as a MICE facilities. That means we are using it for exhibition, conferences, and offices, things like that. And I'm going to show you some photo, before and after photo of the small project, our small project, so that we all would have a clearer idea, I hope, of what we have been doing. The premises actually comprises two parts: the tower part, which was the previous office building attached to the factory space, and the part we call longhouse, which is the factory space. And you can see the before photo on the top and the after photo below. And also another photo from area photo from another angle. Again, the before on the left and the after on the right. And then also a before and after photo of the tower. You can see that, I mean, compare with a lot, I would say most of the old building, to be perfectly honest, our original shape and architecture of the old building perhaps didn't carry a lot of merit, but at least it is one of the first large-scale sugar refinery plants in the whole country. So historically, it means something. Of course, when you purely look at the architecture or the design of the old building, it didn't represent a lot, but the meaning, it really carried some meaning to me, at least. And this is some inside photos. Now we turn the old factory space into a exhibition hall, multi-purpose hall. And then this is a very interesting part. This is a machine we found in the site, and we conditioned the machine and turned it into the project's counter, reception counter, and it is quite interesting. Okay, then that is the background. I would. In the last 4 years, we as a team encounter quite a lot of problems, actually. And mostly, the problems are related to politics, regulations, and rules. Fortunately, unlike the restorations in other more prestigious buildings like the Forbidden City or Tai Kwun, our old building didn't carry a lot of architecture merit. So there was a lot of, there were not many things that we need to preserve. But we face another set of problems. For instance, nowadays in the whole mainland China, people encourage on regeneration, conservation. But at the same time, the corresponding building and planning regulations have been developing in a quite slow pace. And to give you a good example, now the governments at all levels, central government right down to the very local authorities, aim is to renovate more old buildings to suppress housing price. And it's a very good thing. But the reality is, if you look at the current land use regulation, it is actually very, very difficult to change industrial use into residential use. So that is part of actually the main reason why in the middle of the process, we had to change from the project from a co-living space into a MICE project. we just couldn't get the necessary permission to turn a industrial premises into a residential apartment. So we had to make do with a lot of things. So this is one of the example. And the other smaller but equally problematic issue is the gaps, quite big ones, between physical condition of the old buildings and requirements of modern building regulations. I mean, our building, the old building originally actually was not that old, 50, 40 years old maybe, but it's extremely difficult to renovate such a building, especially a factory, into a residential premises or even an office or exhibition area, which comprise with all the modern building regulations. So these are really, really, really big challenges to most developers, especially small ones like we are. And the other thing is, also the other thing what we see is, on one hand, which is a good thing, there's a rising awareness about the importance of conservation. But because of that, it makes the government and even the public demands more from the conservation projects. We have to spend more in making sure it's safe, of course, look more beautiful, and etc. And it means the more the developers or the people who involved in the project are required to chip in, there will be less incentive, investment incentive. So ultimately, it boils down to one very big question: where does the money come from? I mean, people have to decide if we want the conservation, and the private sector couldn't afford all the costs. Government somehow must come to help, must contribute. But the government money actually is the public money. How much are they willing to pay? So it comes to that make us come to another issue, which is the sustainability of the whole thing. And when it comes to sustainability, to me, I think it's very important to give old buildings new life. And essentially, is to find commercially viable uses for old buildings. I mean, let's be frank. Many heritage buildings can be used as museums or library, which are mainly public funded. So we must find interesting use for old building, which, if we operate it wisely, can be sustainable commercially. According to our experience, our 12 portal or 12 gate project attracts quite a lot of attention, simply because people come to use it. People come to use it as an exhibitions for luxurious cars. People come to the building to conduct their workshop, team building exercise, especially for companies from with creativity backgrounds. They like the setup, they like the design, so they come to use it. And this, I mean, to us, is very, very important. I mean, no matter how much we spend in a project, no matter how good we design the building, if we are not stimulating people's thought when they come to use it, I don't think we can survive, and I don't, definitely not for long. And so, to me, a sustainable heritage project must also be a viable commercial project. And that means it must also be operated as a viable community, a viable commercial business, both from the promotions to ranging from the promotion to the management aspect of it. So when I look around Hong Kong and China and the mainland, I see more and more conservations coming up literally on a monthly basis. But the results are actually quite, the range is really high, I mean, big. We have some very successful projects, many of them a lot. For those not so successful projects, sooner rather than later, they will become a trap for the people, for the investors. And the more failed project we see, the less people, the less number of people and the less amount of money will come in the future and put into, and less effort will be put in the conservation field of it. So it is very important to make the whole thing sustainable. So finally, unavoidably, we come to some, to me, quite deep soul-searching questions. Social priority. I mean, undeniably, environmental protection, for that, heritage protection is included. And economic developments are two very important pillars of modern civilization. And these two pillars are with intertwined but sometimes conflicting interests. The big question again is how much the public is willing to pay in terms of direct and opportunity, in terms of direct and opportunity costs for conservation. I give you a very example. Mike is here, and he worked for Hong Kong Jockey Club for a long time, and I used the two projects, very successful projects supported by the club as examples. Hong Kong Jockey Club donated 3.8 billion Hong Kong to Tai Kwun, which Mike will speak a bit more later. And about 25 years ago, this Hong Kong Jockey Club start contributing now up to now, total of 1.9 billion Hong Kong to the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. I'm 100% sure without the Jockey Club's contribution, we might not have these two projects in Hong Kong, not at the same time anyway. So Hong Kong is so fortunate in the sense that we can have both projects. Hong Kong Jockey Club can foot the bill. But assuming we were in a situation where we could only afford, Hong Kong as a city could only afford one project, how would I always wonder, how would Hong Kong people compare a world-class heritage project, Tai Kwun, in this case, with one of the finest university in Asia, Hong Kong UST? Which one Hong Kong people would prefer if we could only have one of the two? So I think we have been in Hong Kong, we have been taking things for granted for so long. We assume someone like Hong Kong Jockey Club or other benefactor will come to the scene and give whatever we want, but we have to decide our priority. And this is something that I think we have to adjust. And at the end of the day, all the issues boils down to one very simple but important fact. That is our individual's civic role. The awareness of the importance of conservation versus other socially desirable things. I mean, how much individuals are willing to pay for conservation? I mean, let's face it, to visit a heritage project like Tai Kwun, free of charge or very low fee is one thing. But if you ask our people to foot the bill on a pro rata basis, it's quite another. So in short, I think more education and promotion on heritage protection, conservation is urgently needed. And it would I hope it would promote awareness of the issue. And at the end of the day, better understanding of heritage protection would mean more meaningful discussion among the stakeholders. And hence, better, I hope, leads to better allocation of resources. So this is what I would like to share and discuss with my friends here. And thank you for your attention. I'm more than happy to answer your question at a later stage, if you have any. Thank you again.
SC, Dodgesai.
Again, thank you.
Really, actually, Elizabeth, one of our audience, has asked if you can come to Scotland. So we would welcome you, I think, in some projects here. Your expertise is terrific. I did wonder, as you chose a former sugar refinery, if that related to your work with Swire many years ago, the old Tai Kwun. But perhaps it's just a coincidence that this project is a sugar refinery as well.
Yes.
Yeah, but we have some questions coming up a bit later, but and I think to reassure everyone, we will go a little bit past the hour. I know many people will have to drop off, but there are so many questions that we'll try and give as many people a chance to ask as possible. But first, Mike Moyer, please, Mike, tell us about Tai Kwun. I think it's wonderful, and really everyone should see this terrific project in Hong Kong.
Yeah, this shows you the very central location of the Tai Kwun site. So the solid red line outlines Tai Kwun, which, as Martin said, was made up of Central Police Station, Central Magistracy, and the Victoria Prison, and essentially was a one-stop shop for law and order, in that you have police, the judiciary, and the prison service located in one site, something I've never come across before. The dotted line is the mid-levels escalator, which is a key pedestrian transport mode on Hong Kong Island. And I think the surprising thing when you look at this photograph with all of those high-rise buildings around the site is that it survived at all. The development work didn't start until, the site wasn't fully vacated until about 2006. The buildings date back to the 1840s and range through to about the 1930s. Martin and SC both mentioned the Hong Kong Jockey Club. This was some statistics from 2017, where the Jockey Club is ranked as in the top 5 charity donors. Now, if you look at some of those names above the Jockey Club, those are global foundations. You know, they spend their money all over the world. The Hong Kong Jockey Club spends all of its money in Hong Kong. So you can imagine the impact that it has in Hong Kong is very, very significant. It is the only legal form of gambling in Hong Kong. Now, as Martin will attest, there's plenty of illegal versions available, but legally, betting on horse racing and football is the only legal forms of gaming. The profits from the betting operations then go to something called the Hong Kong Jockey Club Charities Trust. Again, as SC mentioned, the trust has a long track record of creating amazing assets for the people in Hong Kong, Tai Kwun being the most recent one. Something which I think was important to note here is that in the case of Tai Kwun, the Jockey Club didn't just fund it, they took on the whole responsibility to transform this site into something which is of value to society. And a lot of emphasis was also put in long-term financial sustainability. Back in 2007, before I joined the Jockey Club, the club appointed international architect Herzog de Meuron and asked them to produce a very exciting, adventurous scheme for the site, which this image shows. Well, to put it mildly, it didn't really grab the hearts and minds of the people of Hong Kong. It was very adventurous, and it did receive a lot of support, particularly from adventurous architects. But interestingly, it actually became a great catalyst for the next step, which was to have a proper public consultation. So the public consultation, we can see the model on the left shows the site with the very tall buildings around it. The front part of the site, the front nearest to the left, is the police station, and then the magistracies over on the far side, and the prison is on the right-hand side. There were a total of 19 heritage buildings, but 3 of them were deemed to be not of great importance. It was agreed that they could be removed, and that would then create the opportunity for some new development. So basically, the consultation threw up some sort of common factors, which really then started to guide the brief for the site, which was an arts-related use. It should be inclusive. There should be something for everybody. The site should be open to the public, a mixture of culture and leisure. Some F&B, some retail was acceptable. No high-rise. There was a genuine desire to avoid having tall buildings on the site. Heritage was important, but it wasn't, there was a desire to avoid the creation of just a museum. In other words, it had to be adaptive reuse of heritage buildings as opposed to just preserving them for the sake of it. And also in the long term to make sure that the site didn't deteriorate. In parallel with the initial ideas for the site following the public consultation, the government independently, the planning department and the town planning board decided to impose height limits on the site, so that basically ruled out any idea of putting anything tall on the site. And we were actually very happy with that. Sometimes you need to have parameters within which to work, because it does give some discipline, if you like, to the designers. So essentially what emerged was 2 new buildings, one of which was an art gallery, and the other one is an auditorium. And this was to reflect the fact that the cultural buildings themselves, or the heritage buildings themselves, were not very large buildings. They were essentially colonial buildings. They didn't have long span spaces. So to establish a sort of international standard arts and cultural center, we needed the bigger volumes of the new buildings. This scheme was really, I would say, very well received, and it got through its planning and environmental permits relatively smoothly. When we actually eventually got onto the site in 2011 and were able to sort of properly investigate the condition of the buildings, they turned out to be much, much worse than we expected. And it was a combination of neglect, essentially, because the buildings had been vacated and left largely unattended for quite a long period of time. But there was also a lot of botched repairs, repairs which had been done over the years with inappropriate materials. And just to give you an example, if we looked at the tiled roofs, which were on a lot of the buildings, our initial assumption was we might have to replace all of them. Well, eventually, half of them, sorry, eventually we had to replace all of them. And so that was the initial challenge. How are we going to basically understand these buildings better? The whole question of adaptive reuse, people often said to me, how did you decide what to put in a building? Well, often it was the building that decided what could go into it, because you had to take into account the constraints of the buildings. I've put this slide as euphemistically called working closely with government departments. The reality was this project took heritage conservation in Hong Kong way beyond the experience of any of the government departments. And like SC mentioned, because we were going to have public uses and we were changing the use of the buildings, we had this always this conflict between complying with modern building regulations requirement and also retaining heritage features. And so the whole process by which we went through exploration of the buildings, understanding the buildings, looking at the requirements for future uses, and then trying to find solutions which would satisfy both buildings departments and heritage conservation was a very lengthy process. We were able to do a lot of desk studies or research into the site. I think our heritage architect, Purcell, found over 3,000 documents in the Public Records Office in Kew in London, which led them to be able to understand how the site had been developed over the years. And so when we opened up the ground and found something, we normally, or almost without exception, we found what we expected to find. What we didn't find any pre-colonial relics, because that probably would have seriously slowed the development of the site down. So the site must have been pretty well undeveloped before the colonial era when the development took place. Skilled labor was a challenge because the stonework, brickwork and plaster work on the building is not something that was typically used in Hong Kong. So we managed to get work permits to have 12 skilled operatives come from London. And they actually then trained a local workforce. So by the time the project was finished, essentially it was the local workforce that was completing the work because they'd all been trained in the use of the materials. And we imported, I think it was 40,000 bricks from England because the brickwork on the buildings were largely built of bricks from England, and we needed to get color matches particularly for the exposed brickwork. So as Essie said, it was quite an expensive project. Unfortunately, the Jockey Club had set an objective to do it to an exemplar standard at the beginning, and although I had moments where I had to go to board meetings to get the budget increased yet again, I have to credit the fact that the board always backed us and always provided the funding when we needed it. And this is the finished project. It opened in May 2018, and so it took us 7 years from the time we went on site to complete it. And it's being operated by the Jockey Club for a period of 10 years. It does require operating subsidies at the moment, but it can move towards a more financially sustainable model, although arts funding will always rely on philanthropic funding to some extent. But the club are committed to an initial operating period of 10 years, which will finish in 2028. And so whether it then hands over to somebody else or whether they continue with it, it's a decision that will be made at that time. It had over 3 million visitors in the first year, and so it has proven to be a very, very popular site. One of the key factors was the bridge link, which was a very complex piece of engineering to connect us to the mid-levels escalators. And I think it's something like 45% of the people coming to the site come through that one rather narrow entrance, but it is the key link to the people movement. It has had quite an impact on the area around it. In terms of the regeneration that it's created. People want to live and work beside Dai Kwun because it's a very nice piece of open space in a rather congested area. So yeah, lots of challenges. As SC said, I was very fortunate to have a financial backer that had the commitment and the ability to see the project through in the way we wanted it. And that it is one of the biggest challenges, I think, for heritage projects is where is the money coming from and can you make it sustainable? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. I suspect that the project aged you a bit, or certainly tested your patience at times, but your Highland wit and humour got you through, I'm sure. I'm very glad to say, actually, also on the call today is Tim Kalnin from Hong Kong, who's the director of Tai Kwun. Obviously, anyone from Scotland, please, if you visit Hong Kong and visit Tai Kwun, do look up Tim. I'm sure he'll buy you a drink at Tai Kwun if you say that you're on this webinar. So we have around 10 minutes left, but we'll run over if people would like to stay on, those who don't have other meetings or calls coming up. And perhaps I could just ask one of the audience if they'd like to ask their question. We have Sadiq from Azerbaijan who's studying his PhD in China. So I think that's an international enough mix that we'd really like to hear your question, Sadiq.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate this conference and webinar. So hello, everybody. So I'm Sadiq from Azerbaijan, as you said, a master graduate from Beijing Normal University and current PhD at Incheon University. So, okay, so.
Please.
So I have a question to Dr. Gao about, is there any ongoing project from the University of Stirling which they are doing to promote old historical famous buildings in China which were described in Chinese literature? Because my previous university was doing a project to promote the old buildings, famous buildings from the Chinese literature. Is there any project from the University of Stirling?
Promote historic buildings. Well, I don't know whether the work we have been doing with this Crystal Palace considered as promoting. Would like to think one of the side effects is to promote it, but I think by itself it has pretty much quite a name. Not really, to answer your question shortly. In terms of promoting, we are basically the focus on conservation and also the understanding of the conservation process from an ethnographic point of view. That's mainly our focus. And apart from the Palace Museum, we also have a collaboration with the Terracotta Army Museum, but that's nothing to do with building. So sorry.
I see. Okay, thank you very much. I do appreciate it.
Okay,
Thank
you
you
very much, Sadiq. We have quite a few questions, so I'd just like to ask Deborah Wallace, you sent for a question. Would you like to ask yourself?
I want to ask SC. Thanks very much, everybody, though. They've all been really interesting. But SC, was the legislative barriers the biggest time drain when you were developing 12 gates? And how long did it take you from start to finish?
Well, the whole project, I think from the initial concept formation stage to when it was finished, almost 5 years. I mean, for a small project like us, it was a long time. As I referred to a bit earlier, we went into all sorts of problems, big and small, ranging from water protection law to fire regulations, you name it. I think the issue is that the whole thing of conservation in China, surprisingly, is still quite new. I mean, of course, when people do good things in Xi'an or in Beijing, they have the full support of the government, and they still went into a lot of problems. I think Dr. Gold could verify it, but still, they would have the backing of the government to iron out the issue one by one. In our cases, to be perfectly fair to the local authorities, most of the time they were supportive, they were on our side, but the lack of previous experience really takes its toll on the project and the process. So when we identify a problem, we would have to come up with our own solution and then talk to the relevant local authorities, and we would try to do it one by one, so solve it one by one. So this is quite a tedious problem, but I don't think we can easily find a long-term solution to it, because every individual conservation project is so different. The problem we face in this 12-portal, 12-gate project may not be identical, most probably not, identical to the problem that faced by other projects. We are contemplating of doing some other things, but I am fully prepared for the fact that the experience we learn in the 12-portal project may not be very useful in the future projects to come. They are so different in terms of historic background, in terms of physical situations, architectures, and things like that. So we have to solve it one by one, and that is the reason why the involvement and understanding on the part of the public and the government is so important. Eventually, at the end of the day, I think most of the public, or most of the project have to be helped by the government if we really want to finish it in a good way. I mean, it's not virtually impossible for the private individuals to foot the bill 100% by themselves. It's just, in most cases, it's just commercially not viable. That's what I'm trying to say.
Thank you very much, SC. Perhaps we could just ask a very specific question, and if you don't mind, in the interest of time, I'll ask it on behalf of Nicholas, and thank you, Nicholas, for the question. But a very specific question for Dr. Gao. What is the intended remedial action for the decayed cast iron columns that you showed in the Crystal Palace, repaired or replaced? And then maybe as a follow-up to that, after Dr. Gao, perhaps we could ask Mike to say something about the replacement of original materials in these buildings, because it's a huge issue. And I think Mike has been through that with Daegun. So Dr. Gao, the cast iron columns, would you like to say something about that?
That's a very good question. And also that's one of the major issues involved in this whole project, what to do with the cast iron material. And exactly what we're going to do at the moment, it's still deciding, it's still undecided, because there are several options. First of all, like what's the, how to say, the final demands for, let's say, final expectation for this whole building in the end, whether we're going to allow visitors to go inside, because there's a path that actually, if it's possible, visitor can actually go inside to this building, and what kind of what kind of status, what kind of the story that the final project want to convey to the visitors, also gonna that kind of consideration will be taken into account when we decide what kind of a material, what kind of a let's say intervention is going to be carried out on this original material, because at the moment we are still studying the composition, the origin, and also the, let's say, the properties of the different material involved in this very building, the mortar, the stone, also the cast iron material. At the moment, we are still deciding that, because that's the key issue in this whole project, and there are a lot of different consideration involved to the decision-making process.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry. With the cast iron, I mean, we had examples where we had cast iron columns which the engineers determined weren't bearing very heavy loads and could be retained. We had other situations where we removed the cast iron columns and replaced them with steel, exactly the same profile. We kept the cast iron for future reference again. Replaced them with steel with the same size, but replaced the column capitals. So their appearance, has changed. And another situation I can think of, we basically put steel structures in either side of the cast iron column, but left the column there. We had much more of a problem with brickwork. The older buildings were built of local bricks, and although the bricks themselves had a reasonable strength, the fact is the mortar didn't have sufficient lime content, and the combination of the bricks and the mortar was actually very weak, coupled with the fact that some of the original construction was, particularly of the residential buildings, was very poor. And we did actually have a partial collapse of a building, which led us to have to do a complete reappraisal of every building on the site. And the biggest building, the Barrack block, we actually had to put in a new steel structure and basically jack up the floors to take the weight off the original brick walls, because, in theory, they could have collapsed at any time. in practice, there were areas where you could see that they were very weak. And this was one of the difficulties. The Antiquities and Monument Office, which was the regulator, didn't allow us initially to do any in situ strength testing. In other words, cutting holes, putting in jacks, and testing the actual strength of the wall. And so we were doing laboratory testing of strength, which doesn't really give you the real answer. But after we had the partial collapse, they conceded that this was the only way of determining whether buildings were strong enough. And so we did quite a lot of that type of testing. Now, again, we had Arabs with the engineers, and they had a London-based team which had a lot of heritage expertise and experience in UK that they brought to the project as well. And overall, I think, you know, these things are major challenges that any heritage project has to face up to, and it comes back to the fact that it took us longer to find the answer that they should have done, partially because of the lack of experience, both in the regulator and with us. You know, there was a genuine lack of knowledge and experience on this topic. And what we did at the end of it, we documented everything as a sort of lessons learned. So if there's any other projects in future, can look at all of the solutions we came up with for reference.
Thank you very much, Mike. We've really gone over time, but I'd just like to ask one final question from a member of the audience who's asked if I could ask on his behalf. And it is a fascinating question, I think, to close. For each of the panelists, could you say, or have you thought about this, which building or structure anywhere in the world would you like to see restored? Obviously, putting them on the spot here. I'll give you a few seconds to think only. Dr. Gao, sorry, you came for, or anyone like to go first? I leave it up to you. Who's got something that comes to mind? Anyone? SC, you look very confident.
Well, I think this is not Martin, I don't think it's a very fair question, honestly. Because human life involves so many aspects of things: history, science, philosophy, and buildings represent different things. Use the mainland China as an example. I mean, people love the Great Wall, people love the Forbidden City, people love the Water Village in Fujian, and they all, to me, are equally important, one way or another. So to me, as Dr. Gao just referred to in her presentation, the essence of conservation is to pass on thinking, philosophy, belief, and things like that. And I really don't think there's any single building which are more important than others. I'm not trying to be too diplomatic, but I think a lot of things are quite equal. So sorry, Martin, I couldn't give you a solid answer.
No, you've answered the question perfectly, actually. And actually, I think the audience member who posed that question has come back as well and talked about intangible heritage. So it's not the building, it's not the structure. There are a lot more factors around buildings and structures that are more important. And I think you've answered that beautifully. Just closing remarks. You don't have to say a building, but Dr. Gao or Mike?
Well, I'm going to be very selfish, and I'll mention that I'm on the project board for the refurbishment or transformation of the King's Theatre in Edinburgh. I mean, it's over 100 years old. It was a wonderful Edwardian theatre, but you know, it does require some improvement. It's a great building and it's in good condition, but basically things like barrier-free access, fire protection, it needs that upgrading. And we have a £25 million project getting lined up and ready to go. We just need to find the money.
Really, there's so many comments come in by direct messaging or to all on the Zoom chat of how fascinating this event is. Obviously, because of the panelists, Dr. Gao, Mr. Liu, and Mr. Mike Moyer. Really, thank you all three of you very much. There's also been a request, will your slides be available? So we'll follow up with you later and see if they may be in any way. And if you agree, then we could put them on our website for any members of the audience to download later. I really can't thank all three of you enough. It's lovely to see images back from Hong Kong and Guangzhou, SC, and a place in the Forbidden City, which I'd never seen before, the Crystal Palace. It's obviously one of the lesser known parts of that extraordinary area. But thank you all three for such great insight to this and giving your time. And thank you for the audience for joining us today.